Well, first of all, welcome to Tallinn, everyone.
Thank you.
I think I was asked a hard question. I can bounce the hard question to you now, right? So you heard Eric Schmidt offer a view. You heard Jan of Tallinn offer a view. So any takes and any sort of follow-ups from them. So if you're in a political role now, so what's your takeaway from this? What to start working on, or are we actually talking about the wrong thing still?
No, I think we're talking about the right things, just from my part, because there's always this balance between regulating and keeping also innovation alive. But what we've been doing and seeing in the past years is that we had very little regulation. So there was this whole world that somehow also turned into a Wild West, both within the government and also outside. So having this regulation now in place, or getting in place, which we're doing in the European Union, is of course super important. And then again, and we were talking about this, Carme and me, also earlier when we had our bilateral meeting.
All right.
So we missed a bit of all the things.
Huh?
Yeah. So we keep you in between. But the whole thing is also that it's not only about making the right regulation. It's also about who's actually going to control it. But how are we going to make it implemented? How we make sure that everybody, basically follows the rules, but these rules are not going to be counterproductive.
Okay.
So I guess we're kind of having this balance between, yes, we still need regulation. We also need the private sector to be able to create the great things that AI and digitalization can bring. But we definitely need to be together. And there's always this third group, which is the group that we know very much in the digital sector, which is not government, it's not private sector, it's communities of people that invent great things that we can use.
All right. Well, there's quite a lot to unpack in the sort of exactly next time we have with us. All right.
Great, thank you. I thought Eric Schmidt in particular hit on a really clear example of how AI works, because I think sometimes it's a term that we use that covers a wide range of things, and that's social media. Social media is driven by recommendation algorithms which promote content. And actually, when we talk about, in the UK, we talk about things to do with online safety and the Online Safety Bill, very similar to how the EU looks at the Digital Services Act as well. Principally, what we're looking at is those recommendation decisions. What's being recommended to who and why? Why is it the AI is drawing these reference points to select content for people? Is the data input correct? Is it a fault from where the data is coming from? Is it a fault in the system of how it's being used? The solution to that problem is often AI-driven as well. I look certainly in the UK, at a number of the companies that work in the safety tech sector. They're developing tools for big platforms to use to help find harmful stuff. So I think what we need to look at is what kind of guiding principles are there for the inputs of AI, the sort of data that is being used. Data that would recommend harmful content to people. There's clearly a problem with those data sets being used in that way. And that's why in the UK we're launching on Wednesday this week the AI Standards Hub, working with the Alan Turing Institute, where we can start to try and set more of those rules for the road. We want people to be innovative. We want to give certainty to companies who are developing AI tools and systems which we know work well. We don't have concerns about the unintended consequences. There might be other areas where are more sensitive, where we want to give companies guidance as to what we think good practice looks like, what regulators in the future will be looking at from companies. And I'll just say finally on something on regulation. I think similar to the DSA, the UK Online Safety Bill, it's not there to sort of come up with a list of bad things companies shouldn't do and then hit them with a stick every time they do it.
Right.
It's to work with companies and say, let's make the AI better. Let's make the systems more responsive to the real world problems that can happen, sometimes unintended, but nevertheless, for the user's point of view, absolutely important. And I thought the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, was absolutely right in her remarks, that ultimately, we need to think about the human as the end user. It has to be designed with the user and the person in mind.
That's the same community.
Yeah, exactly. Right. When we think about AI, in the palm of a teenager's hand on their smartphone, what are they being exposed to? Is that right? Is that fair? We want AI as a fantastic opportunity for the world, but we want to make sure we debug it as well.
Although to be fair, I think you could argue that a lot of the issue of what the teenagers have in their hand is not even like an AI thing, right? It's just content much more largely like that, right?
Well, but if you take an app like TikTok, I've got teenage children, so TikTok plays it does play a big part in my life, plays a big part in theirs and the conversations we have coming from it.
But 4 or 5 hours per day.
When you open up TikTok on your smartphone, what you're seeing first is a piece of AI. People aren't being invited to search for things. They're seeing content that has been selected for them based on the data profiling of the user. So how can we make sure companies get more of those decisions right about the tool they select? It wouldn't work without AI. but nevertheless, sometimes the AI can make the wrong decisions.
And that's exactly, I think, sort of why Eric was emphasizing on the reach aspect of things, right?
Yeah.
Carme?
Yes. I think that after the two fireside talks, we have seen two sides of the same coin. First of all, we have seen the vision of Eric Schmidt when you have all the benefits and potential of AI and the need to not hamper innovation and not hamper creativity and new startups and applications and growth. And on the other side, with Mr. Tal, we have seen the potential risk, even existential risk, and the need to regulate beforehand, or at least having brought into consideration not only short-term benefits, but also long-term risks. And I find this is the challenge we have as policymaker, where we put the balance between ex-ante and ex-post regulation, between preventing a market to grow when it's innovating, while it's iterating, and at the same time preventing ourselves from future harm. I think that's the key. And before we regulate, I think we should agree on what to regulate, because what we are seeing today is that not only human existence, which is probably a more long-term future that we are honestly considering, but also how AI is harming our democracies, how AI is harming the trust on institutions. And I think that we owe it to the next generation to solve two important topics that we do not solve today. There will be no second chance. One is climate change. If this generation doesn't solve it, we don't have any planet B. But at the same time, if we're not good at now identifying the key long-term risk and prevent it from happening, there will be no second chance to reverse back the harm that will make to humanity and to the rights. And I think that's where we have this sense of urgency. We need to make it right, this generation, these policymakers, because we will have no second chance. And this is why we started 2 years ago, at least in Spain, to reflect on what we call the Charter of Digital Rights.
Okay.
What are the rights that we have currently offline as a mature democratic societies, of course, that we want to preserve in the online world, but also what are the new rights we need to ask related with AI, the right not to be discriminated by an algorithm, the right of a second human opinion, or even what is still more scary is the rights related with neurotechnologies, human augmentation, brain manipulation. So because fake news will be just a joke. So all these things we must have into consideration and have a common ground, because otherwise we cannot solve it, because it's a global problem.
And I think it's also, one of the challenges that we have, and I fully agree with Carme that we need to do it, is that, we solve this before it becomes a crisis. I do remember in the early 90s, I was working in energy and also in sustainability. And at the time, if you were pro renewable energy, you were really out with very few people that were actually, you were like, bah. And nowadays, it's, we know how important it is to have renewable energy sources for loads of reasons. So in order to start on time, it's also important that we not only, form the right regulation, make sure that we just, as you say, make it human-centric, do it based on just what we find normal in the offline world. Let's make that normal in the online world as well. But also make sure that we talk to people and talk about the urgency of the matter, because somehow, it seems to be that loads of people are not understanding right enough what the digital world is doing and how it works or how it involves them, and how it's, for instance, as you say, basically demolishing our institutions, sometimes also like media and so on and so forth.
But just to your point, Alexandra, the risk we have, that next generation cannot claim for rights they don't know they have.
Exactly.
They are not claiming for the ownership of their data because they have never owned their data. They are not claiming for right to be forgotten or intimacy or privacy because they have never lived that. And I think it's our responsibility to try to make those rights also for the next generation. They are not claiming those rights because they don't know they have.
And make sure that apart from this community, a whole other group of people, basically all our citizens, are realizing what's happening.
But we already have rules for the road to help us with this. So if you look at the principles that underpin GDPR, there are protected data characteristics. So you're not supposed to infer things about people's political beliefs or religious beliefs or sexual orientation without their informed consent. So you can start to look at sort of standards set for the way AI tools are developed to say, well, if you are developing tools that are going to promote an extremist political ideology based on inferred data, there's already a question as to whether that is legal under GDPR. And I think the more we can give, platforms and developers certainty over what are safe areas to invest in and not. And I think that's why the digital sandbox project that
Yes.
you're working on in Spain
The AI
is so
sandbox.
important, I think, and they have this in America as well, in Washington State, on facial recognition technologies. In other industries, this is quite normal, that you go through a form of testing and trial when it's something novel and there could be unforeseen circumstances. And the more we can build in, we can try and do those dual things, which is both promoting growth in the sector as well as reasonable regulation to prevent harm.
And also have that done, beforehand, because, you can't put a vacuum cleaner on the market if it's not up to certain standards in order to make sure that, you can safely use it. We need to do that with AI and other technologies as well. Not only talk about, how we can correct it if it's already, the damage already done, but also how we can do it beforehand.
But that all, in a way, seems to be the heart part of the debate, and you all acknowledge this, right? I mean, essentially, where do you strike the balance, right? Because in many ways, again, if we go back to even sort of Eric Schmidt, or let's say what the industry is saying in Europe as well, is saying, hey, well, guys, we're going too far. Yes, of course, we need principles. We need to exactly, have the Charter of Rights and so forth. But then again, we're going too early, too far, right? So what would still be your sort of response to that sort of challenge? And where is the balance?
So I don't agree with that we're going too far, because we're just started, right?
Okay.
Loads of the regulation is still up in the negotiation process. We have the DSA and the DMA, but it still also needs to be implemented. So we're still far ahead from the idea that it's hampering too much. What I do believe, though, is that when we have this regulation in place that's doing the things that also Carme and you are talking about, is that we, of course, talk with industry and the people that are actually regulating or controlling that, in order to make sure that we implement it as fast as possible, because we have learned some lessons out of the GDPR, which was implemented in very different ways and all throughout Europe, and has also led to things we do not like. But I don't think we're in a situation right now where we're too far in the regulation. No, we're just starting.
All right.
But you can unpack this too. So if you take the social media example, you could. So we had a case in the UK of a recent coroner's inquest into the death of a teenage girl called Molly Russell, who died 5 years ago. The coroner's verdict there is to say that recommendation tools on social media platforms that she used played a role in her decision to end her life. Now, the outcome of that, I think, can be, okay, well, what were the data feeds that the company was drawing on that allowed it to make those recommendation choices against its own terms of service in doing so, but nevertheless it happened? How can we make that better so that doesn't go away? The response is not necessarily to say, let's end all algorithmic recommendation on platforms, but let's say, you need to make this better, and in the short term, if you can't, there may be fixes that need to be put in place. But these are the sorts of normal conversations that the regulators and governments should be having with businesses, but making really clear that that this sort of regulation is not content moderation, it is systems regulation, and saying to companies, you've designed this system to work in a particular way to make you money, so you are responsible for it, and you can be held to account for that.
Well, there is also one take on this.
Yeah.
It's just say that, I mean, you can also focus on, it's the outcome moderation perhaps is the goal of the regulation, right? Whatever sort of happens in the box in between, but Carmen.
No, just coming back to the example you mentioned on the AI sandbox, I think that can be an example of how we should future regulate, because it's a future-proof regulation. We are joining, I would say, legislators with practitioners before the law comes into force, and say, okay, we have this idea, this is the way the law is structured, how can we make it actionable? How we define guidelines and ways to implement? Because as you mentioned, a very good example of GDPR, but it was really a nightmare to implement it, especially for small and medium businesses. So we want to really anticipate that, and together we're going to exercise, of course, at the national level, but we, of course, are inviting the rest of members of you and also other partners to really test the legislation as if it was to be enforced tomorrow. What are the things we need to, what are the data set we ask to the companies? What are the auditings we need to perform to the algorithms? How do we assess if something is dangerous or not? Because I think the good balance on this regulation is that we are not regulating the technology per se. We are regulating the potential harmful applications of that technology. Sure. And as you also mentioned, I think it's good that we start considering that we need to iterate. Because technology is iterating all the time, version 1, 2, and 3, and probably the laws will have to have version 1, 2, and 3. Probably it's very challenging, but I think that's the way we are going.
Right, because you saw the back box, but there's basically data that goes into the box, and there are systems that come out, and what you can look at is what the inputs are. So there was a story about Amazon had designed a recruitment tool, I think they did it themselves, where the tool favoured men over women because the system had learnt the fact that men were more likely to get the jobs than not. So it was taking human bias and then amplifying it through AI.
Yeah.
But actually you could say, well, you could, if you changed the inputs, you'd have had a different outcome. And I think we shouldn't regard, because there is a black box in the middle of it, there's hard to see what's going on, doesn't mean to say we can't take a view as to, well, what data is being fed in and how is that data being used. And that is, I think, what companies can be asked about.
Yeah, there's also a special role, I think, for government, because we are using AI as well to make our decisions or to do risk assessment. But there we definitely also need to be very aware of what we have as an input, need to know the systems and also check on the outputs, because this is what went completely wrong with the tax office in the Netherlands and with the devastating results for loads of families who had to pay back loads of money that they couldn't. So it's not only with the private sector and the industry, we also have to really look at at what we are using as a government and be aware that we use the right thing.
Yeah, probably not in terms of risk, because there might be, as you mentioned, TikTok or whatever, influence on youngsters, teenagers, also mental health problems, isolation, discrimination. But also as a governmental body, we need to be transparent with the citizens in publishing our algorithms in open source and be ready for auditing.
Exactly.
And we, for example, now in Spain, we are going to launch the first national agency for supervision of artificial intelligence before the end of the year. And that's something we encourage an effort at the also European level to align those criteria and share best practices. I think that's important.
Absolutely. I think on the building of that on the point on growth is that I think governments could look at it and say, well, what data do we hold that actually could be made accessible to companies to innovate and help us improve the delivery of services based on using that data? Are there artificial barriers across government which is preventing that work being done and denying opportunities? And I think alongside that goes trust and transparency as well. I think for our host Estonia, I think one of the reasons their system is so successful is there's a high level of public support because it's very transparent as well. You can see what's being used and why, and you can give your consent for that.
Open data, open regulation, open decision making, open AI, all these things as a government should be very transparent. And then of course everybody can use it to its own benefit, but nevertheless the citizens know what's happening, and also the ones that represent them, so like NGOs and so on.
Or at least they have a recourse to know if they choose
exactly,
to.
And then they understand how it works, or their lawyers do, or their NGOs.
But the understanding part now, and I think this is really striking in this as well. For example, you're starting the agency for supervising AI, right? I mean, that's a very high barrier. I mean, in terms of the capability of also public sector staff, to really be on top of this game, right? Or how to strike the right sort of standards, right? And so forth. So is there anything specific that, for example, you have been doing in your governments to really bring the public sector up to speed? I mean, Jan Tallinn was also throwing an example that, hey, actually we're talking about stuff how things used to be 5 years ago in some ways, right? Yes, we could partner with the private sector, like you said, and actually involve them and so forth, but anything special you've been doing to really bring your public sector sort of, workers, your policy teams up to speed?
So yes, we're doing stuff, but I don't think it's enough, right?
Okay.
And I also believe that we need to do it on a European level, because the people that really understand AI are not,
too few.
Not too few. If there's ever anybody that really understands everything, right? So really, there we need to really work together, and of course we can, of course, in terms of regulation and bringing up to speed people, it's very important to cooperate with the private sector to see what the outcomes are and so on and so forth. But European cooperation is super important, because we might end up in a situation where actually nobody knows. I'm worried basically worried about the level of skills, digital skills, not only people in government have, but also in the private sector. It's still loads of CEOs come on stage and say that very proudly that they have no idea how their app works, right? I mean, you don't say that about finance, for instance, or I don't know, whatever you are what is important to your business, but there's still this idea that it's okay and cool to say that you don't get it, which I don't think is a very good thing. And that is, even far beyond from understanding or having a basic understanding of AI.
I think that's very important. I mean, in our discussion so far, we've spoken more about regulatory challenges and trials, but I think I look at the role of the Office for AI in the UK government and the AI strategy. That is part of it, but part of it is encouraging. I think part of its job is to look across the public sector to see where there are opportunities for AI to be used to improve service delivery, to help boost skills as well. So we directly fund 2,000 PhD places in the UK for people working in AI as part of trying to build up our own talent network as well. So these sorts of things are really important in considering how you support the development of a sector which is going to be integral to the way everything works, the whole economy and the delivery of public services.
And also with school kids, right?
Yeah.
This is also which you did, I understand, here in Estonia, is you start with the youngsters. Yeah.
Yeah.
In our case, we have a very ambitious digital agenda for the long term, like in 2025, funded mostly for the European Next Generation Fund. And I always say that we have the challenge to solve at the same time short-term, mid-term, and long-term challenges. Short-term is leaving no one behind, especially the population that still lacks of basic digital skills, also the SMBs that are not yet into the digital economy. On the mid-term, really transforming the most important industrial sectors to digital sectors. Currently in Spain, the digital economy, if it was a vertical, will be 22% accounting for the GDP. But we need to evolve them to the data economy, and also on the long term, investing in AI, in quantum technologies, and neurotech. But especially on the mid-term, which is how can we help our industries evolve to a more competitive data economy. The importance here is data sharing, creating spaces for data sharing, B2B, G2G, G2B, B2B and B2G. And I think that's important when we are talking about how are we making the European industry more competitive. I think we need to find use cases for sharing data between companies in the same vector, but also along different countries in Europe to make really our industry much more resilient. And that's what we are promoting from Gaia X initiative and also the national chapter, and particularly in Spain, we're leading the data space for tourism. But that's something that there is no yet the clear business case that encourages several competitors to share their data along the value chain. But I think that is one of the key important assets to
having
promote.
an infrastructure for that is, of course, something that we also are working on in the European Union. I think it's very important also to keep that going on, because there's this focus that we all have on digital skills and how we can, from young kids to elderly people to business people and so on. There's the AI that we were talking about. There is creating identities, but also the idea of making sure that we use data in the right ways is super important, because we have so much to share also. I'm just not because my country is a small country, but loads of these things, like here in Estonia as well. I mean, you can develop it in your own country, but it will only fly if it becomes a more of an international.
But let me snap that sort of data sharing and stuff for a bit now. I really want to get back to this, as a heart of trusted connectivity. But just to finish up on the sort of AI stuff a bit, and as a sort of continuation from the morning, there was a very strong view, and you all advocated exactly. Perhaps we are only starting to do stuff and then only catching up in a way. There was a very strong view that we are diverging, right? And in the sort of global big picture, we should actually be coming together, right? American sort of regulation, European regulation, British included. I mean, other stuff as well, right? So what's your take on that? I mean, are we diverging? What's the way to do that? How can we get together if actually views are quite different?
What I like very much is on AI, so on artificial intelligence. We're now negotiating a treaty in the Council of Europe where you are with us and also the Americans are with us. So the idea of creating that treaty that is based on the regulation that we already know and that we all work with is something that I find very important, because the idea is it's human-centric, it's about how we're going to regulate this world in a way that actually is going to work from the perspective of human beings, from the perspective of our national values, as also Ursula von der Leyen was saying. And I find that a very good place to have these negotiations going on. Which will make it more easy for us all to work together, because we need these, I think, these treaties all
and
together.
So you're also saying there actually is a good forum for that already also?
I think it's a great forum for it, but then again also this forum needs to be combined, of course, with also NGOs and the business community, because none of the regulation, I think, is going to fly if we not also have a close cooperation with the people that actually have to implement it. But the other thing is that we can have nice treaties, it's like the GDPR, but still, we need your sandboxes. We need the idea of how can we implement this together? How can we make sure that it's going to work in practice as soon as we want, because we want it to be effective. We hear the private sector also saying, at least loads of them, please make the regulation and make it as clear as possible so we can work with it and we can do it in a compliant way. I used to work in the private sector when the GDPR was implemented. I asked somebody, so what do I actually need to do as a company? And nobody was able to tell me, not hang up the birth dates of people in the canteen. Well, which is this, but the idea of helping with all these regulations that we're now building, and I hope, of course, the Brits will be on board there as well, because we need to do that. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think we should work closely together on that. I think be it on data adequacy, digital competition, digital safety standards. We're all looking at the same sorts of issues. We should be working closely together, and understanding the technical challenges that we're all facing. I think what I'd hope to see across the range of issues is that we see a kind of leveling up, where we look at what others are doing, we talk to them about what they're doing, we learn from that, we adjust what we're doing to be best in class if we think someone else has got a good idea. I mean, plenty of people made a fortune of money by looking at someone else's good idea and making it better. So we should, we can work together in that way too. I think there's a general presumption that we want to see, the theme of this conference, it's all basically about trust. Do we trust another country to process our citizens' data in their jurisdiction as if we were doing it at home? And achieving trust in those areas, be it through the UK, EU, North America, Japan, and other countries, other G7 countries, that we have that level of trust, and therefore that was the best way of securing the opportunity of digital trade in the future. And I think we are pretty close. And I think the more we can work together and inform those policy decision making, that this is achievable, and be reasonable with each other as well. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but we have to have confidence that we trust the systems.
Okay, so trust enough in a way.
Yeah.
No, totally agree. I mean, we need these multilateral cooperation environments and also public-private partnerships to agree, I would say, in the three levels: on the regulation, on the business also side, but also on technology standards. And I think we need standards. We need to agree on standards which make it practical, what we aim in terms of regulation, and this framework of, for example, data sharing with trust and data flows, especially with the UK. I think we cannot think about European market without UK. So we need to find a way, this partnership, this trustful partnership cooperation, which is the slogan of this summit, I think it's more important than ever.
And we also definitely need practical things for people, right? So for instance, creating this wallet or e-identity together is something that I truly believe, because it's going to be very helpful for people. Otherwise, it will be regulation on AI. I mean, what does it bring me as a person? So if you present the nice examples where we show that we can do it together based on trust, based on secure sharing of data, I think that is going to be very important, to make services for governments better. If I want to rent a car in Spain, or if I want to do something in the UK, that I can do that with my own data, protect it on my own wallet, things like that would be very helpful.
And we do this in other sectors. We have, you can move money around, you can send money anywhere around the world, and it's international systems, but anti-fraud, anti-money laundering regulations work around the world, maybe in slightly different ways, but there are common systems there. Same in telecoms. There are plenty of global industries that have embraced this in the past. I'm sure we can make it work again.
But there's a point here we need to bear in mind that I think when we talk about data sharing, as you mentioned, with trust, means that my data as European is covered outside Europe the same way that it would be when I'm inside Europe. And that's something we need to bear in mind. We cannot just renounce to our own data protection, especially on personal data, because of the sake of trade. I think that e-commerce cannot be, of course, limited. We need a single digital market within Europe, and we need to continue with the commercial relationships between countries, but not at the expense of leaving our data and protected. And so until now, the only discussion was around personal data. But I think we should start broadening that scope and considering as a strategic also our industrial data, especially when we're moving towards a digital world, digital twins, and really the critical competitive factor of our industry will be some settings of a digital twin that is probably more efficient than another competitor. So I think we need to start broadly on what that trust means.
But also I think, we haven't touched upon the issue of disinformation, but that's also something that we need to work on together, because one of the things that's hampering trust and lowering trust in, institutions, the government, the court system, all kinds of science, not in the least, we've seen that in the Corona period as well. To work towards this is super important, because this is basically about the content, and it's not about it's happening to little kids that they might end up killing themselves in the strangest ways.
Okay.
But it's also about, of course, the war in Ukraine and how we are, stuffed with all kinds of disinformation from Russia. And I think it's going to be far more important also to very much look into this system and see how we can regulate that.
So basically keep that part of the package in a way.
Certainly.
But if we turn largely our discussion to this still sharing of data, and which you've all been itching to, and I mean you could easily argue that even if it doesn't solve all the sort of long-term issues of AI trustworthiness, it's still harder the connectivity, right? Trusted connectivity. So what I've been hearing from you is that if I should ask, what's the state of play for us there? I mean, Europe and globally, then I've been hearing from you that, for example, there's no business case perhaps yet, or in a way that's not sort of trust the frameworks still in place, even if we're discussing them in a way.
But
so
we can start as governments, right? We can just make our data open. So at least we as a government could do it to each other, to the world, basically. So I think that is one step that you can take.
Okay.
Because I'm not talking about, your personal tax application.
You can have mine.
Okay, good. But maybe not on the web. But I don't think everybody will like that.
Doing it.
Okay, well, I don't think the Dutch would like that very much. But the idea of, all kinds of data, whether it's about climate or trade or whatever, could be very much shared about spatial planning, stuff like that. So I think one of the things that we can do is as a government show the example.
Show the way, show the example.
And also show the example of what you share and what you do not share and why you do it and why you don't share other things. So I guess that is super important to do. And I also hope that when we are sharing data, actually the world is becoming a safer place, because it's harder for people to trick or to do something, because there's always the open data to say, no, it's not true, you're saying.
Okay. But are we incentivizing it enough? Because that was your point, in a way, let's say, especially with industrial data. I mean, the first digital summit here, 2017, it was the collection of all, basically, unofficial council for Europe, right? So all the heads of state were here. That was the main thing that Estonia brought forward, saying, hey, look, let's have free movement of data, including then business to business or industrial and so forth. And perhaps little has happened. So perhaps why? And again, is it a question of incentives? Is it a question of something else?
And my point of view, I think that that's exactly what we're trying to do, for example, in our Spanish chapter of Gaia X, especially in the tourist sector. We had just made 2 workshops with the industry, trying to identify those use cases in which they require data from other in the value chain, because that is a challenge they cannot solve alone. In fact, we need to find those incentives for data sharing, because data sharing has to do, especially in our national culture, it's not that often that you share your data or your discoveries with a competitor. We're talking about, again, with co-competition. And I think that must be, of course, economic interest for data sharing. It doesn't mean to pay back. I agree with you that also the example is on opening governmental data for innovation, for researchers, for the industry. We have done it all in the past, but it has not been effective. The initial open government portals that we had 10, 15 years ago are not effective. So we need to just have whatever code repositories and more actionable data, and that's the way to go. And I think in these three levels, regulatory, technically, and business, Europe is doing a great job, but in all these 3 levels, we're in a very early stages. So in regulatory, there's the first attempt is the Data Act, when we start regulating data markets, especially from IoT generated data. We have incorporated the concept of data donors, which I think is very interesting, that the citizens decide also what is the data, which is personal data, but they are ready to share for research or for forever. And then we need the incentive for the industry, and we need those standards. We don't have, for example, also the example of Gaia X at European level. The technology stack is not mature. We are not having interconnectors for federated data among different application sectors or territory. So we need to advance in the three levels, I think. I think
the pandemic is a good example of how governments can use public data. So I was talking to a friend who works in the UK government on this, and at the start of the pandemic, the allocation of ventilators to hospitals sounded like a description of a city trading floor in the 1980s of people screaming down telephones. Sort of, But actually, but then they created a data dashboard, so everything was allocated perfectly in real time. And if you think something like that, okay, you can gather data and say how many people are being admitted to hospital, based on the emissions data, how many people are likely to need a ventilator in 7 days' time? And data could tell you that. It's not really a personal data issue because you don't need to know who those people are individually. You just need to know what the journey is as well. So I think that's an example of how you can open up government data sources to, in a way that is not in any way prejudicing the personal information of an individual, but to design more effective services. And I think it'd be good to look across government sectors and say, well, where else could you do that? If it's like, the phasing of traffic lights in a city, or the number of buses that appear at a particular time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's also about, how you make policies, for instance. So what we're doing now is not only presenting a bill to Parliament, but all the information that was before that, how we negotiated, why we made certain decisions. And since we do it, there's far little discussions about, what is actually behind it, because we mystify a lot of the things that we do, or at least people believe that we're mystifying a lot. And now it's all open, you can see what kind of choices we made, why we choose to make that article, and it's easier.
But then again, I mean, in many ways, the gold mine, or let's say where the sort of a lot of more profitable stuff comes from, is the sort of personal data, is the sort of industrial data. I mean, things that are not necessarily public data like that, right? Which can generate economic outcomes too, but still. So I guess in a complicated way, I would still like to sort of tease you a bit on that. So. So how can we still unlock this? I mean, so basically, what would be the number one priority to really do that? I mean, is it one particular framework that is missing? Is it?
Well, actually, I think one of the things that we can do more from a technical side is make this kind of synthetic data or data twins or stuff, so you can use personal data, although it's not reliant or it's not connected to a real person. Yeah. So you can use all that data to make better policies, whether it's in healthcare or not.
Would you make companies publish it? So that every data set would be accompanied by something synthetic or fake, just to be out there and to help training?
If it would be really, if it would not be connected to personal data, I would be very happy to have that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned infrastructure and you mentioned Data Act. I mean, so would these really be the magic keys, you believe?
Not by itself alone. I think we have to have this said. You were mentioning, for example, health data and how the pandemic has shown the need to share data to solve a global issue. We see that more and more in public health policies. We not only need to, for example, share health data. We need to combine that health data with environmental data, with data from fertilizers in the agriculture, for pollution, and that is probably will guide our future public policies that are based on data, based on evidences. That's what we are not doing today. Of course, this is putting a lot of challenges to policymakers, because when you are taking decisions based on data which is public, then you need to be accountable. Yeah. And we need to be absolutely transparent.
And you better be right. This is our business. This is our business.
You better
That's
be
also
anyway.
challenging.
I think trust is about gathering the right amount of data. I remember about 3 years ago, when I was giving the e-Estonia presentation. The thing that really stuck in my mind was was showing how you signed up for a Tallinn city transportation card.
Right.
And the data that was needed was not to know where you lived, but that you lived in the city. So, and I think we've seen a lot of systems develop, particularly in the private sector, where basically the system's set up so they gather as much information as they possibly can, whether or not they need it, and then they make a decision about what they'll do and how they use it. I think you can build more public trust when people have an idea of, okay, I'm engaged in a transaction here, I'm giving this data, and in return I get something back, and I've got some sort of knowledge over how that works. And I think we may see that develop with sort tools anyway, and we're starting to see this already at device level, where actually citizens can prevent certain types of data access, when it's not relevant to the transaction that they're engaged in.
No, because people are doing it right now. You buy a pair of socks on the web and you type in everything. Yeah,
exactly. I wouldn't. I'm not a great game player, but I mean, if I wouldn't like, say, my attitude to risk to be assessed by how I played Fortnite, and that to affect my premiums when I pay for insurance. That would be possible, to do. Yeah.
No. Yeah.
I want just to, because you were talking about inflation, it came to me. Economic indicators, no? And the challenge we have is that the more we are moving towards a data economy and we want to measure the impact of anything with the data we have, no data, no policy. So if we don't have data, we don't have an evidence, we don't have a reality we want to rule. And the second part is that we are measuring the impact of data correctly. We are not measuring data economy. All the indicators on our economy are based on a model that doesn't longer exist. And for example, our GDP, our national GDP, doesn't measure the real economy. We're only measuring the economy based on economic transactions. But all the services we have and we pay through data are not in our GDP. So if every time a European made click on Wikipedia, we were paying 1/10 of a euro, our national GDP would increase 10%. But that we are not putting onto our national accountability because it's not an economic transaction. So if we want to evolve, and we are evolving towards that economy, we need to define new indicators. That happens with the startups. Data is not activated in the balance sheet of a company. No data, no talent. How can we pretend that people invest in talent and in data if it's not reflected as an investment in the company? So we need to change also the way we are measuring the economy, because that's now it's like we're driving in like blind.
And I guess your point is that would also direct the discussion to the right place, because we would know what we're talking about in a way.
Absolutely, we don't know the impact. This is why we have companies that have, I would say, a negative P&L or results, and that are valuable, I value like billions in the stock market, because the stock market is not considering your P&L on your balance sheet. It's like, okay, and this is why we have this volatility these days. Where does the money go from? Go to NFTs, SPACs, billion valued companies that are not confronted with real measures of the economic value. So we need to invest also in finding the right indications, the right indicators for the digital economy.
But Damian, I mean, I'll sneak in a sneaky Brexit question in a way, so bear with me. But post-Brexit, what are your digital industry companies coming to your government, to you, saying, hey, look, help us do the digital trade? I mean, do they have these asks, or, or how high is it on their table to really get data flowing like that, and whether to spread their stuff out to get access to whatever like that?
Well, yeah, as we talked about, I mean, sort of, data flow with trust is kind of important for all of our economies, and so the UK is looking to enter into new trade agreements, particularly in Asia Pacific, Australia and New Zealand. We have discussions obviously with the United States as well, and data adequacy agreements are a really important part of that. As I said earlier on, I think it's a question of recognising, and the government is looking to bring forth its own data bill, which will reform some aspects of GDPR, but I think there are some things which I think are overly bureaucratic and not very effective. I think the constant cookie reminders, which are just an annoyance, and no one even bothers reading anymore because they just want to click accept just to get on to the thing they're looking at. There are certain things that were built into it, which I don't think, if we reform some of those things, it fundamentally changes the rights citizens have. We're just going to do it in a slightly different way. So an adequacy agreements or equivalence agreements, even equivalence, is about saying it may not be exactly the same, but it does the same job, and we trust the way it's being done enough to know that we're happy for data to be shared across those territories. And I think that is the system I think we want for looking at the whole of the G7 and beyond. That is in many ways the way in which we can create a world where businesses can trade internationally, where data can be shared around the world within territories where we know its integrity will be respected. So that's absolutely what we want, and I think we're not alone in that.
And that would be the vehicle of this convergence or recoupling, if you wish, right? The adequacy agreements.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but I think, but we want those. I mean, as I said earlier on, things might not be done in exactly the same way, but they protect the same things. And I think that's, and we think there are some improvements we can make, and we'll publish. We'll be debating our new data bill in the coming months.
But any other views on that? I mean, especially look from indeed, debate in European Union is going on, right? Like you said, then it's not a done deal yet. I mean, what the sort of outcomes will be, right? So, if we look beyond Europe, what do you see should be the priority to really get this sort of more global understanding jointly? Here we're talking about data, not AI anymore, right?
No.
And to get data flow.
It's definitely also something. Of course, the talks that you are speaking about are important there. So it's the G7, it's the G20. We were there. I mean, it's all of great importance to have that. Go and see how we can work together there. One of the things that I think we should debate a bit more also now is, of course, we have been talking, and this morning also, about energy and how we can make sure that we get the energy system, be it resilient or more autonomous than it was in the past years. And I think also in that sense, we also still have to have that balance between, yes, wanting to share data and stuff, but also making sure that whenever, when push comes to shove, that we're able to take care of ourselves. within the European framework, within the European community, and our neighboring states. I mean, I very much applaud the talks that we had in Prague. When was it? Last week. Last week.
Right.
Because those are the things I think we need to discuss these days very much. Because we are just as fragile in terms of energy as we are in terms of data flows, connectivity, and especially also trusted connectivity, which we are talking about today.
Yeah, I think another important aspect where I think, certainly in the European context, the UK and the EU are looking at the same problem, through our different mechanisms, is on competition. And I think that will be an increasingly important part of data policy as well, which is, are there competition biases within systems? Do companies use data they gather about another company's activities when that company can't avoid reaching its customers, but through their systems? Is that managed in a fair way? And I think that will play, in the near future, certainly with the DMA and the future legislation we will bring forward on digital competition, I think will be increasingly important.
But there are two ways to try to look into the future. One thing is to try to predict, obviously. The other thing is to build it yourself, right? Prime Minister Kallas was saying the same thing this morning, and she was also saying that how the summit is like a place to not get to an agreement yet, but at least set the tracks for this, right? So if I were to ask you, 1 year from now, we're back in Tallinn, we hope all you come. What's your hope in terms of what should have or could have happened by then? What will we have to or hopefully have had achieved by in a year's time in the space to really have this sort of bigger, trusted connectivity and data flows? More data flows between ourselves, our countries, cross-border, etc., globally, in this like-minded sphere.
But if question, Prime Minister Kallas' question, what are the tracks for that? I think that is strategic dialogue. I think between.
So we haven't had a strategic dialogue.
Yeah.
But how far let's say, ideally we were gotten with it?
Hopefully we're just a bit further ahead. So, for instance,
not done yet.
Sorry?
Not done yet.
So not done yet, but I would like if it's done, because I think we need to start, right? This is all about also not endless discussions and negotiations, but starting up a project. So we're starting up projects, for instance, on the wallet in several countries and working there together and exchanging data, for instance. But we can do more if we want to just start up projects and do it together. Work on your sandboxes project that is being established now in Spain. You work on data flows and look at it, and I hopefully also look furthermore into how we can make our system more resilient, because that is something that I believe needs to be a bit more on the forefront than we have talked about it today. But basically, it's all about just getting started also, because we talk a lot, but we can also just start doing projects.
Well, indeed.
For my opinion, in 1 year time, I wish first of all that the war is over, that this war doesn't lead us to a new bilateralism, but a new multilateralism, reinforcing especially the transatlantic cooperation. On the cybersecurity space, which is important as we see. We're talking about data a lot. We need to assume that the broader the digital space becomes, the higher risk we are facing. So we need absolutely collaboration. In terms of European legislation work, we expect in 1 year time to have a Data Act, which is agreed, the European regulation on artificial intelligence, and that will be at the same time Spain is hosting the presidency of the European Union. So we have really an important task to do. Yeah. We expect that we have important outcomes from the AI sandbox with the participation in several member states, and that we have really found the right incentives for data sharing. And I want to reinforce here an idea we have not covered in this session, but it's important, the concept that the digital sovereignty of Europe also is a data sovereignty. We need to ensure that the Europeans' data is based in Europe, processed in Europe, in clouds that are resident in Europe, and that is not against a single digital market or not against international trade, but an understanding that this is a key strategic asset for our competitiveness.
Yeah, and I think you look at all those, and when I said strategic dialogue, you didn't let me say to what ends, but if you look at it and say, we'll look at the work that's been done at the moment on safety, on trade, on competition regulation, on I think setting standards for the use of AI, and the desire in all the work streams of all these organisations to promote data adequacy and data sharing arrangements to underpin business, to open up more government services. To see substantial progress across all of those areas in the next 12 months, which is an entirely attainable task. I think to look at improving digital infrastructure with the reconstruction of Ukraine, as you say, when the war is hopefully ended. All these efforts are moving in the right direction. I think the gaps between us are pretty small, actually. I mean, the principles that underpin it are very strongly aligned, and therefore I think keeping that dialogue going is really important, because this is all new stuff. We are all, and I think we will do better by learning from each other's, the way we are approaching it, separately but also together.
But I mean, sorry.
No, go ahead.
But you're all essentially digital ministers, right? And I was asked this question by Sandra before that, okay, how are you going to convince politicians that it's important? You all have, and your governments have so many things on the plate. And mind you, in the big picture of things, digital stuff doesn't win elections, right? So do you see that the time is ripe that we can get enough sort of focus and effort in the next year or two or whatever behind to really get these things done? Because in a way, it has always sort of fallen back in the agendas. But
some things, yes. I mean, so I think if you take something like online safety, that was something I think 5 or 6 years ago there was less of a public awareness of. I look at most of the polling and research I see, particularly in the UK, says that the public see this as a big priority now. The reason Eric Schmidt said earlier on, every time he talks to a politician, they just want to complain about social media, is because the public are complaining. If politicians are complaining about it, it's because the public are complaining about it.
Right.
So in terms of that accountability, transparency, the sense that some of the bigger companies need to be held to account for the decisions they make, I'm not saying that is the thing that's going to swing an election. I think public concern around disinformation, rising levels of hate speech, rising polarisation in society. I think people do care about these things now, and they want to see governments doing something about it.
Yeah, so that's basically the choice of right piggies in a way, right? The right piggies to piggyback on in a way, right? Yeah. So that has also changed, is your point.
Well, I think there's on those issues there's a higher level of public consciousness. Okay. Digital infrastructure, that is certainly an election winner. People, if people can't get online, they're pretty quick to let you know, so they expect to get a good service. But I think on some of these other issues around the consequences of poor data management, poor decision making from AI systems, those things, I think, poor digital competition, how that affects services. I think people will start to think about those things more and more. But I would certainly say the digital agenda is more central to politics in Europe now, rather than as opposed to government. But it has been ever before.
But still, we need. I think it's still not central enough. So because usually in loads of politics we start acting when the crisis is there,
right?
And we're not seeing a lot of the crisis actually. Right. So one of the things that we need to do also is just to make sure that it becomes in the forefront of the discussion, which is of course not very easy because loads of things are happening in the world. It's the war in Ukraine, of course. There's inflation. There's concerns about energy and stuff like that. But so. I think it's also our task to make sure that it becomes, as far as it's not, a topic that's higher on people's agendas, because that's what we're here for. And we're not only here to make the decisions about things that people, have already in the forefront of their mind. We know, Carme was saying it very eloquently earlier, this is what we need to solve. This generation needs to solve it. So let's do it. And then, if we're not getting re-elected, tant pis, we'll do something else, right?
But government is not also just dealing with the things that are top of the news agenda.
Exactly.
Sometimes it's dealing with the things to stop them becoming top of the news agenda in the future, because you've fixed the problem in time.
This is what we do.
I have an advantage because I'm not a politician, so I don't think about terms of elections. So, as I mentioned, we're not thinking about a term or election. We're thinking about long term, as I mentioned, short term, mid term. At the same time, we don't do it today. The one that comes after, we have no time to correct the drive. And I say, I'm not going to see the high road with all the lights. Probably I need to make just the basic pavement just to set the road. And I think in Europe we have this great opportunity of the Next Generation EU funds that have really put a booster on those things that we already know were important, but now they became urgent. And I think this sense of urgency is the one that I think should guide our
and some of the
action.
things are connected to urgencies, right? So this idea about resilience or sovereignty or autonomy are very much much connected to the
Yeah.
situation with the war. Same accounts for disinformation. So those are the things that are definitely on people's minds, and that actually are topics that we have to promote far more. But on the other hand, yeah, it's also our business to make sure that people are more aware, and also look at countries that already are leading the way there, or where people are more focused on what do I like or do I not like in terms of my digital world.
The important thing for me is that we involve the citizens in the discussion.
Exactly.
The citizens should be part of the governance and put the limits of we expect.
Because
or
if
not
they
in
are
the
aware,
technology.
then suddenly they're like, oh wow, is this what's happening to my data? I didn't know. I was clicking yes, and I don't know
Okay.
what's happening.
Well, given the time we have, I think exactly I can, as I let all the fireside guests, right, have a closing argument. 3 sentences that they would really say, hey, their pitch to what should these guys take away from you, your country, yourself. Anyone want to start? What's your closing pitch from all this discussion
Okay.
to focus on?
Exactly. So I think we need to keep talking as international governments together. We need to build public trust. I think in the way public data is used, the way public systems are used, and we need to do those two things of having a pro-growth agenda for the sector, working with businesses to create better systems and tools, but also have the ability to hold people to account for how they use that power.
All right.
Yeah, on my side, I think that digital transformation is more necessary than ever, but we cannot make it at the expense of losing in the process guarantees and rights that we have taken centuries to achieve a democratic society. So we need to have a human-centric approach of this transformation. This requires a consensus about what we want to recognize as digital rights, not only at the EU level, but also elevate the discussion at international level. And I think that European Union is doing a great job in trying to find standards and common frameworks for data sharing to enable really a responsible AI development.
And let's get them agreed, basically.
Yeah, what I believe is also that, as has been said today also, now is the time to act. So we know digital transformation can bring great things, but it's also can be very scary. And we've seen that in many examples, in many countries and so on and so forth. So now is the time to act. To do that in Europe, very important, to find as many countries that want to align with us and work with us, that would be even better. And then I also believe that we need to, in the coming time, to show some examples, whether it's about data sharing, about creating wallets together, about making sure that we agree on this AI Act and we do it together and look at how we can implement it together. That would be really, really important for the coming 12 months, I would say. So if you're hosting this next year, let's talk about these 4 things. I would love that.
Well, the practical thing is exactly like, you sound like an Estonian.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
Small
look,
countries, right? Yeah.
You have been excellent in a sense that I can share with the audience. Very few questions were sent ahead of time to this gang, so you've been very good sports in terms of actually having a free-flowing discussion, which often we don't get with the ministers. Thank you so much. Good luck to us all with that, and welcome back next year. Thank you.
Thank you.